of the rings of power in the third age, in which these tales come to their end. Of old there were Sauron the Maya, whom Sindar and Beleriand named Gorthor. In the beginning of Arda Melkor seduced him to his allegiance, and he became the greatest and most trusted of the servants of the enemy, and the most perilous, for he could assume many forms, and of long, if he willed, if he could, appear more noble and beautiful, so as to deceive all but the most wary. When Thangordrim was broken and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again, and did obeisance to Eowyn, the herald of Manwë, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that in this was not firstly falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the lords of the west. But it is not within the power of Manwë to pardon these of his own order, and he commanded Sauron to return to Aman, and there receive the judgment of Manwë. There Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation, and to receive from Valar a sentence, it might be of long servitude, in proof of his good faith. For under Morgoth his power had been great. Therefore, when Onwë departed and hid himself in Middle-earth, he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. In the great battle and the tumults of the fall of the Thangordrim, there was mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. In the east, in Osiriand, the walls of Ered Luin were broken, and a great gap were made in them towards the south. A gulf in the sea flowed in. Into that gulf the river Lon fell by a new course, and it was called therefore the Gulf of Lon. That country laid of old Ben Linden by the Noldor, and it said his name Belor thereafter. Many of the Eldar dwelt there, lingering, unwilling to forsake Beleriand, where they had fought and labored long. Gil-galad Sin of Fingon was their king, and with him was Elrond of Elven, son of Erendaril the mariner, and brother of Elros, king of Numenor. Upon the shores of the Gulf of Lon, the Elves built their havens, and named them Mithlond. There they held many ships, for the harbourage was good. From the grey havens the Eldar ever sets on, fleeing the darkness and the days of the earth, for by the mercy of the Valar the firstborn could still follow the straight road, and return, if they would, to their kindred in Ersea and Valinor beyond the encircling seas. Others of the Eldar there were. They crossed the mountains of Ered Luin in that age and passed into the inner lands. Many of these were Tel'arai, survivors of Doriath and Osiriand, and they established realms among the Sylvan Elves, and woods and mountains far from the sea, from which none the less they yearned in their hearts. Only in Aragon, which men call Holin, did Elves of Noradorin race, establishing a lasting realm beyond the Ered Luin. Eregion was nigh to the great mansions of the dwarves. They were named Khazad-dûm, but for the Elves had Hodrond, and afterwards Moria. From Ostin Edel, the city of the Elves, the high road ran from the west gate of Khazad-dûm, for a friendship arose between dwarves and elves, such as never been elsewhere seen, to the enrichment of both those peoples. In Eregion, the craftsmen of the Gwaithep and Edain, the people of the jewel-smiths, surpassed in all cunning all that it wrought, save only Fëanor himself. Indeed, and greatest in skill among them was Celebrimbor, son of Cerufin, who was estranged from his father and remained in Nocgorond, when Celagorm and Celofin were driven forth, as it is told in the Quent of Silmarillion. Elsewhere, in Middle-earth, there was peace for many years, yet the lands were before most savage and desolate, save only where the people of Beleriand came. Many elves dwelt there, indeed, as they had dwelt through the countless years, wandering free in the wide lands before the sea. but they were Evari, to whom the deeds of the Beleriand were but a rumour, and the Valinor only a distant name. In the south and the further east men multiplied, most of them turned to evil, for Sauron was at work. Seeing the desolation of the world, Sauron said in his heart that Valar, having overthrown Morgoth, had again forgotten Middle-earth, and his pride grew apace. He looked with hatred upon the Eldar, and he feared the men of Numenor, who came back at whiles and their ships to the shores of Middle-earth. But for long he dissembled in his mind and concealed the dark designs he shaped in his heart. Men he found the easiest to sway of all the peoples of the earth, but long he sought to persuade the Elves to his service, for he knew that the firstborn had the greater power, and he went far and wide among them. His hue was still that of one of both fair and wise. Only to Lindon did he not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming, though they knew not who in truth he would, and would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the Elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon, bidding them beware, for Sauron took to himself the name of Anatar, Lord of Gifts. They had at first among them much profit from his friendship, and he said to them, "Alas for the weakness of the great! For a mighty king is Gil-galad, wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the Elves could make it as fair as Erisea, nay, even as Valinor? Since you have not returned thither, I might preserve that you might love these Middle-earth as do I. It is then our task to labour together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all elven kindreds that wander here untaught, to the height of the power and the knowledge of those who are beyond the sea." It was in Eregion that the counsels of Sauron were most gladly received, and for in that land the Noldor desired ever to increase the skill and subtlety of their works. Moreover, they were not at peace in their hearts, since they refused to return into the west, and they desired to stay both in Middle-earth, which they indeed had loved, and yet loved to enjoy the bliss of those that had departed. Therefore hearkened to Sauron, and that they learned of him many things, for his knowledge was great. In those days the smiths of Ostanedo surpassed all that had contrived before, and they took their thought, and they made rings of power. But Sauron guided their labours, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the Elves, and to bring him under their vigilance. Now the Elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and last only so long as it too shall last. And each of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring, for the power of the elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency. And Sauron forged it in the mountain of fire in the land of shadow, and when he wore the one ring he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those who wore them. But the Elves were not so likely to be caught, and as Sauron set the one ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and so he knew them, and perceived them, and he would be master of them, and all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings, but he, finding that he was betrayed, and that the Elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them with open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him, since the elven smiths could not be attained to their making without his lore and counsel. But the rings fled from him, and 3 of the rings they saved, and bore away, and hid them. Now these 3 that had been made, and possessed the greatest powers, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, they were named the rings of fire, and of water, and of air, set with ruby, adamant, and sapphire. Of all the things and elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them, though for those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time, and discover them. For those they were given into the hands of the wise, who concealed them and never again used them openly, while Sauron kept the ruling ring. Therefore 3 remained unsullied, forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron had never touched them. Yet they were also subject to the One. From the time that war had never ceased between Sauron and the Elves, and Eregion was laid waste, and Celebrimbor slain, and the doors of Moria were shut. In that time the stronghold and refuge of the Imglaris, that men called Rivendell, was founded by Elfarum, half-elven, and long it adored. But Sauron gathered into his hands all the remaining rings of power, and he dealt them out to the remaining people of Middle-earth, hoping thus to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. 7 rings he gave to the dwarves, but to men he gave 9, for men proved in this manner as others the readiest to his will. All the rings he governed as he preferred it, the more easily since he had been a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all that used them. The dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame. Their ill endured the abomination and domination of others. The thoughts of their arts are hard to fathom, nor they could be turned to shadows. They used their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts. Of evil enough came to the prophet of Sauron. It is came to the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings. Of old was the golden ring, but all those hordes long ago were plundered, and the dragons devoured them, and the 7 rings were consumed in fire, and some Sauron recovered. Men proved easier to ensnare. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life came undurable to them. They could walk, if they would, unseen by all the eyes of this world beneath the sun. They could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men, but too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron, and one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength, and to the good or evil of their wills, in the beginning they fell under the thraldom of the ring that bore, and under the dominion of the One, which was Sauron's, and they became forever invisible save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered within the realm of the shadows. The Nazgul were they, the ring race, the enemy's most terrible servants. Darkness went with them, and they cried with the voices of death. Now Sauron's lust and pride increased, for he knew no bounds, and he determined to make himself master of all things in Middle-earth, and to destroy the Elves, and to encompass, if he might, the downfall of Numenor. He brooked no freedom nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth, a mask he could wear, so that if he wished, he might deceive the eyes of men, seeming to them wise and fair. But he ruled rather by force and fear, if they might avail, and those who perceived his shadow spreading over the world called him the Dark Lord, and called him the enemy. He gathered again under his government all the evil things of the days of Morgoth that remained on earth or beneath it, and the orcs were at his command, and multiplied like flies. Thus the Black Years began, which the Elves called the Days of Fright. In the time, many of the Elves of Middle-earth fled to Lindon, and thence over to the seas, never to return. Many were destroyed by Sauron and his servants. But in Lindon, Gil-galad maintained his power, and Sauron dared not to yet pass the mountains of Ereluin, nor to assail the havens, and Gil-galad was aided by the Numenorians. Elsewhere Sauron reigned, and those who would prove free took refuge in the fastness of wood and mountain, and even feared pursued them. In the east and south, well, all men were under his dominion, and they grew strong in these days, and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war, and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god. They feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. Yet there came at length a stay in the onslaught of Sauron upon the Westlands. For it is told in the Acabelas, he was challenged by the might of Numenor, so great was the power and splendor of the Numenorians in the noontide of their realm, that the servants of Sauron would not withstand them, and hoping to accomplish cunning what he could not achieve by force, he left Middle-earth for a while, and went to Numenor as a hostage of Talcalion, the king. And there he abode, until at last his craft he had corrupted the hearts of most people, and set them at war with his valor, and so encompassed their ruin, as he had long desired. But their ruin was more terrible than Sauron had foreseen, for he had forgotten the might of the lords of the West in their anger. The war was broken, and the land was swallowed up, and the seas rose over it, and Sauron himself went down into the abyss. But his spirit arose and fled back upon a dark wind to Middle-earth, seeking a home. There he found the palace of Gagalad had grown in the years of his absence, was spread now over wide regions of the northwest, and had passed the misty mountains and the great river to even the borders of Greenwood the Great, and was drawing nigh to the strong places where once he had dwelt secure. Then Sauron withdrew to his fortress in the Black Land, and meditated for war. In that time the Numenorians were saved by the destruction, fled eastward, as is told in the Acabelas. The chief of these were Elendil Tall, and his sons Isildur and Anarion. Kinsmen of the king they were, descendants of Elros, but they made unwilling to listen, as Sauron had refused to make war on the lords of the West. Manning their ships, who all remained faithful, forsook the land of Numenor, ere his ruin came upon it. It was mighty men, and their ships were strong and tall, but the tempest overtook them, and they were borne aloft on winds of water, even through the clouds, as they descended upon Middle-earth, like birds of the storm. Elendil was cast upon the waves of the land of Lindon, and he was prevented by Gil-galad. Thence he passed upon the river Lun, and beyond Ered-Luin he established his realm, and his people dwelt in many places of Eredil, and about the courses of the Lun, and Barad-dûn. But his chief city was at Enumias, beyond the war of Elatnilulio. At Fornost, upon the North Downs, the Numenorians dwelt, and in Carcolon, upon the mountains of Redor, and towers they raised upon Erin-Baraid, upon Amon-Sur, there upon Murray Barrows, and ruined works in these places, but the towers of Erin-Baraid still looked towards the sea. Isildur and Anarion were borne away southwards, and at the last they brought their ships upon the great river Anduin, that flows the river Vanian, in from the western sea, from the bay of Baphalas, and they established a realm in these lands. They were named after Gondor, while the northern kingdom was named Arnor. Long before the days of their path, the mariners of Numenor established a haven and strong places about the mouths of Anduin, despite Sauron and the Black Land that lay nigh upon the east. And in the latter days this haven came only the faithful of Numenor, and many therefore were the folk of the coastlands in that region, whole and in part akin to the elf friends and people of Elendil, and they welcomed his sons. The chief city of this northern realm was Osgiliath. Through the midst of the great river flowed, and the Numenorians built there a great bridge, upon which there were towers and houses of stone wonderful to behold, and tall ships came up and out of the sea and in the quays of the city. Other strong places they built upon either land. Minas Ithil, the tower of the rising moon, eastward, upon a shoulder of the mountains of shadow, as a threat to Mordor. Then the westwards, Minas Antor, tower of the setting sun, the feet of Menthurion, as a shield of the wildmen of the dales. And Minas Ithil was the south of Isildur, and Minas Anor was the south of Anarion. But they shared the realm between them, and their thrones were set side by side in the great hall of Osgiliath. These were the chief dwellings of the Numenorians of Gondor, but their other works marvelous and strong they built in the land of the north in the days of their power, at Argonath, at Eltharond, at Erech, in the circle of Agranost, where people called Esgard, They made the pinnacle of Orthanc of unbreakable stone. Many treasures and great heirlooms of virtue and wonder exiles had brought from Numenor, and of these the most renowned were the 7 stones and the white tree. The white tree was grown from the fruit of Nimloth the fair, that stood in the courts of the king at Arminios in Numenor, ere Sauron burned it. Nimloth was at a turn descended from the tree of Tyrion, but in an image as the eldest of trees, white Telperon, which Yaravana caused to grow in the land of the Valar. The tree, memorial of the Eldar and the light of Valinor, was planted in Minas Ithil, before the house of Isildur. Thence it was that he had saved the fruit from destruction, but the stones were divided. Therein Ethanil took his sons each 2. Those in Elendil were set in towers of Ethanberaid, and upon Emansul, in the city of Anadunas. But his sons at Minas and Minas Anor, and at Orthanc and Ithgiliath. Now these stones in virtue, those had looked therein might perceive in them things thereof, whether in place or in time. For in most part they revealed only things to another kindred stone, for the stones each called to each, but to those possessed great strength of will and of mind might learn and to direct gaze inward whither they would. Thus the Numenorians were aware of many things their enemies wished to conceal, and little escaped in their vigilance in the days of their might. It is said that the towers of Remembrance were not built by the exiles of Numenor, but were raised by Gil-galad for Elendil, his friend, and the seeing stone of Remembrance was set in Elstrilion, the tallest of the towers. Thither Elendil would repair, thence he would gaze over the thundering seas, where the yearning of exile was upon him, and it was believed thus he would go at whiles to see even when the tower of Alone upon Eressëa, where the Master Stone abode, and yet abides. These stones were the gifts of the Eldar to the Amandil, father of Elendil, for the comfort of the faithful of the Numenor in their dark days, where the Elves might come no longer to that land of the Sauron under the shadow of Sauron. They were called the Palantiri, those that watch from afar, but those who were brought to Middle-earth long ago were lost. Thus the exiles of Numenor established their realms in Arnor and Gondor, but ere many years had passed since became manifest their enemy, Sauron, had also returned. He came in secret, as had been told, to the ancient kingdom of Mordor, beyond the Ethel Duath, the mountains of shadow, and in that country marched with Gondor upon the east. In those valleys of Golgoroth was built his fortress vast and strong, Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, and there was a fiery mountain in that land where the Elves named Orodruin, for in that reason Sauron had sat there dwelling long before. He had used that fire that welled there from the heart of the earth in his sorceries and his forging, and in the midst of the land of Mordor he had fashioned the brooding ring. There he brooded in the dark, until he had wrought for himself a new shape, and it was terrible, for his fair semblance had departed from wherever he had cast into the abyss, and was drowned in Numenor. He took up again the great ring, and clothed himself in power, and the malice of the eye of Sauron few even of the great of the Elves and the men could endure. Now Sauron prepared war against the Eldar and the men of Westerness, and the fires of the mountain were wakened again. Wherefore, seeing the smoke of the Orodruin from afar, and perceiving that Sauron had returned, the Numenorians guarded that mountain, and knew him on a mark, which is Mount Doom. And Sauron gathered him to great strength of his servants out of the east and the south, and among them were not a few of the high race of Numenor. For in the days of the sojourn of Sauron in that land, hearts of all nigh mighty people turned towards darkness. Therefore many of those who sailed east in that time, and made fortresses and dwellings upon the coasts, were already bent to his will, and they served him still gladly in Middle-earth. But because of the power of Gil-galad and these renegades, lords both mighty and evil, for the most part, took up their abodes in the southlands far away. Yet too were Hiramor and Firannu, who rose to power among the Haradrim, a great and cruel people, who dwelt in the wide land south of Mordor, beneath the mouth of Anduin. where their horse Aaron took in time with great force against the realm of Gondor. He took men as they fell, and he destroyed the white tree of Isildur that grew there. But Isildur escaped, and taking with him a seedling of the tree, went with his wife and his sons by ship down the river, and they sailed to the mouth of the Anduin, seeking Elendil. Meanwhile, Andarion held Osgiliath against the enemy, and for that time drove him back into the mountains. But Sauron gathered his strength again, and Andarion knew that unless help should come to his kingdom, he would not long stand. Now Elendil and Gil-galad took counsel together, for they perceived that Sauron would grow too strong and would overcome all of his enemies one by one if they did not unite against him. Therefore they made a league which is called the Last Alliance, and they marched fast into Middle-earth, gathering a great host of elves and men, and they halted for a while at Imladris. It is said that the host there was assembled fairer and more splendid in arms than any that had been sent into the Middle-earth, and more greater had been mustered since the Valar sent against the Thanagradrim. From Imglas they crossed the misty mountains by many passes, and marched down into the river Anduin, and so came upon the host of Sauron at Dagoriad, the battle plain, which lies before the gate of the Black Land. All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either hosts, save for the elves only. They were alone, undivided, and foiled Gil-galad. Of the dwarves few fought against upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. The host of Gil-galad and Elendil had the victory, for the might of the elves was still great in these days, and the Numenorians were strong and tall, and terrible in their wrath. Against Elgios, the spear of Gil-galad, none could stand, and the sword of Elendil filled orcs and men with fear, for it shone with the light of the sun and in the moon, and was named Narsil. Then Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor, and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron, and they laid siege to it for 7 years, and suffered grievous loss by fire and the darts and the bolts of the enemy. And Sauron sent many sorties against them. There in the valley of Gorgoth, Andorion, son of Elendil, was slain, and among many others. But at last the siege was so strait that Sauron himself came forth, and he wrestled with Gil-galad and Elendil, and they both were slain. And the sword of Elendil broke under him as he fell, but Sauron was thrown down, and with the hilt shard of Narsil, Isildur caught the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron, and took it for his own. Then Sauron was for that time vanquished, and he took and forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. Thus began the third age of the world, after the eldest days of the Black Years, and there was still hope in that time, the memory of mirth, for long the white tree of the J.R.R. flowered in the courts of the kings of men, for the seedling which he had saved Isildur planted in the citadel of the Honor, in the memory of his brother, ere he departed from Gondor. The servants of Sauron were routed and dispersed, yet they were not wholly destroyed, though men turned now from evil, and became subject to the heirs of Elendil. Many yet more remembered Sauron in their hearts, and hated the kingdoms of the west. The Dark Tower was levelled to the ground, yet its foundations remained, and it was not forgotten. The Numenorians, indeed, set a guard upon the land of Mordor, but none dare dwell there for the terror of the memory of Sauron, and because of the mountain of fire that stood near to Barad-dûr, and the valley of Golgoroth was filled with ash. Many of the elves and the Numenorians and the men who were their allies perished in the battle of the siege, and Elendil the Tall and Gil-galad the Hiring were no more. Ever and ever again were such as hosts assembled, and to which there were many leagues of leaves and men, for Elendil's day and the two kindreds had been estranged. The ruling ring passed from the knowledge of the wise of that age, and yet it was not unmade. for Isildur would not surrender it to Elrond and Círdan, who stood by. They counselled him to cast it into the fire of Orodruin nigh at hand, to which it had been forged, so it should perish, and the power of Sauron forever be diminished, so he should be remaining only as a shadow of malice in the wilderness. But Isildur refused this counsel, saying, "This I will not have in Weregild for my father's death, and my brother's. Was it not I that dealt the enemy his death blow? And the ring he held seemingly exceedingly fair to look upon, and he would not suffer it to be destroyed. Taking it therefore, he returned it first to Minas Thor, and planted there the white tree in memory of his brother Anarion. But soon he departed, and after he had been given counsel to Melindil, his brother's son, and continued upon the run to the south, he bore away the ring, to be an emblem of his house and an heirloom, and marched north from Gondor, by way of Elendil, who had come. He took the south kingdom, for he purposed to take up his father's realm in Eriador, far from the shadow of the Black Land. But Isildur was overwhelmed by a host of orcs that lay in wait for the misty mountains, and they descended upon him and unawares in his camp, between the greenwood and the great river, nigh Luag Glorian, the gladdened fields, for he was heedless, and set no guard, deeming all his foes were overthrown. There well nigh all his people were slain, and among them were her 3 elder sons, Elendur, Araton, and Cirion. But his wife and youngest son, Valendil, he had left in Imdalaris when he went to the war. Isildur escaped him by his means of the ring, for when he wore it he was invisible to all eyes. But the orcs hunted him by scent and slaught, until he came to the river and plunged in. There the ring betrayed him and avenged its maker, for it slipped from his finger as he swam, and it was lost in the water. Then the orcs saw him as he laboured in the stream, and they shot him with many arrows, and that was his end. Only 3 of his people ever came back from the mountains over the wandering, and one of those was Othar his esquire, of those to whose keeping he had given the shards of the sword of Elendil. Thus Narthel came in due time into the hand of Elendil, Isildur's heir, in Imdalaris, but the blade was broken and its light was extinguished, as it was not forged anew. And Master Elrond foretold that this would not be done until the ruling ring should be found again, and Sauron should return. But the hope of elves and men was that those things that might never be to come to pass. Valendil took up his abode in Annamais, but his folks were diminished, and of the Numenorians, of the men of Eredor, there remained only now too few people to man the land, or to maintain all the places that Elendil had built, and Dagorialat, and in Mordor, upon the gladdened fields that many had fallen. And it came to pass that upon the days of Erendur, the 7th king who had followed Valendil, the men of Westerness, the Dundane of the north, became divided into petty realms and lordships, and their foes devoured them one by one. Ever they dwindled through the years until their glory passed, leaving only green mounds in the grass. At length naught was left of them but a strange people wandering secretly in the wilds, and those men knew not their homes nor the purpose of their journeys, save in Imladris, the house of Elrond, their ancestry was forgotten. Yet the shards of the sword were cherished during many lives of men by the heirs of Isildur, and their line from father to son remained unbroken. In the south the realm of Gondor endured, and for a time its splendor grew, until it recalled the wealth and majesty of Numenor ere it fell. High towers the people of Gondor built, and strong places, and havens of many ships, and the winged crown of the kings of men was held by all the people of the many lands and tongues. For a year the white tree grew before the king's house in Minas Anor. The seed of that tree was Isildur brought out of the deeps of the sea from Numenor, and the seed that came before the Avalone, and before they came from Valinor in the day before days, when the world was yet young. Yet at the last, in the wearing of the swift years of Middle-earth, Gondor waned, and the line of Melindil, son of Anarion, failed. For the blood of the Numenorians became much mingled with that of the other men, and their power and wisdom was diminished, and their lifespan was shortened, and the watch upon Mordor slumbered. And in the days of Telenar, the 3rd and the 20th in the line of Melindil, a plague came upon dark winds out of the east, and it smote the king and his children, and many of the people of Gondor perished. Then in the forts of the Lord of Mordor were deserted, and Minas Ithil was emptied of his people, and evil entered again into the world's black land secretly, and the ashes of Gorgoroth were stirred as by a cold wind, for dark shapes gathered there. It is said that those were the Elf who Sauron called the Nazgul, the 9-ringed race, who had long remained hidden. But returned, and now to prepare for the ways of their master, for he had begun to grow again. And in the days of Eärnur they made their first stroke, and they came out by night of Mordor over the passes of the mountains of shadow, and took Minas Ithil for their abode, and they made it a place of such dread that none dared look upon it. Thereafter it was called Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and Minas Morgul was ever at war with Minas Tanor in the west. Then Osgiliath, which in the waning of the people had long been deserted, became a place of ruins and a city of ghosts. But Minas Anor endured, and it was named anew Minas Tirith, the Tower of Ligord, for there the kings caused to be built in the citadel a white tower, very tall and fair, and its eye was upon many lands. Proud still and strong was that city, and in the white tree it still flowered for a while, were before the house of the kings, and therein the remnant of the Numenorians still defended the passage of the river against the terrors of Minas Morgul, and against the enemies of the west, orcs and monsters and eaglemen, and thus the lands behind them, west of Anduin, were protected from war and destruction. Still Minas Tirith endured after the days of Eärnur, son of Eärnur, and the last king of Gondor. He it was that rode alone into the gates of Minas Morgul to meet the challenge of the Morgul Lord, and he met him in single combat, but he was betrayed by the Nazgul and taken alive into the city of torment, and no living man saw him again. Now Eärnur left no heir, but when the time of the line of the kings failed, the stewards of the house of Mordor the faithful ruled the city in its ever-shrinking realm, and the Rohirrim, the horsemen of the north, came and dwelt in the green land of Rohan, which before was named Caladoron, and was a part of the kingdom of Gondor. And the Rohirrim aided the lords of the city in their wars, and northward, beyond the fold of Rhaeros and the gates of Argonath, there were as yet defences, powers more ancient, of which men knew little, and against the things of evil did not dare to move until the ripening of time their dark lord Sauron should come forth again. And until that time was to come, never again after the days of Eärnur did the Nazgul dare to cross the river, or to come forth in their city shape, visible to men. In old days of the Third Age, after the fall of Gil-galad, Master Elrond abode in Imladris, and he gathered there many elves, and other folk of wisdom and power, from among all the kindreds of Middle-earth, and he preserved them through many lives, the men of memory, and all that had been fair. The house of Elrond was a refuge for the weary and the oppressed, and a treasury of good counsel and wise lore. In that house was harboured the house of the heirs of Isildur, and in childhood and good age, and because of the kinship of their blood, with Elrond himself, and because he knew in his wisdom that one should come of their line, with whom a great part was appointed in the last deed of that age. And of that time came the shards of Elendil's sword, who was given back into the keeping of Elrond, where the days of the Dunedain darkened, and they became a wandering people. In Eredor, Imdris was the chief dwelling of the High Elves, but in the grey havens of Lindon their abode was also a remnant of the people of Gil-galad and the Elven King. At times they would wander into the lands of Eredor, but for the most part they dwelt in the shores of the sea, building and tending the elven ships, wherein those of the firstborn grew weary of the world, that sail into the uttermost west. Ceridan the shipwright was lord of the havens and mighty among the wise. Of the 3 rings that the elves had preserved unsullied, no open word was ever spoken among the wise, and few among the Eldar knew where they were bestowed. Yet, after the fall of Sauron, their power was ever at work, and wherever there abode, mirth also dwelt, and other things were unstained by the griefs of time. Therefore, ere the Third Age was ended, and the elves perceived that the Ring of Sapphire was with Elrond, in the fair valley of Rivendell, upon whose house the stars of heaven most brightly shone, whereas the Ring of Adamant was in the land of Lorien, where dwelt Lady Galadriel. A queen she was of the woodland elves, the wife of Celeborn of Doriath, yet she herself was of the Noldor, and remembered the day among days in Valinor, and she was the mightiest and fairest of all the elves that remained in Middle-earth. But the Red Ring remained hidden until the end, and none save Elrond and Galadriel and Ceridan knew whom it had been committed. Thus that it was that in 2 domains the bliss and beauty of the elves remained still undiminished, well in that age endured, in Imdris and in Lothlorien, the hidden land between Celebrant and Anduin, where the trees bore flowers of gold, and no orc or evil thing dared ever come. Yet many voices were heard among the elves foreboding that, if Sauron should ever come again, then either he would find the ruling ring that was lost, or at best his enemies would discover and destroy it. But in either chance, the powers of the 3 must then fail, and all things maintained by them must fade, and so the elves should pass into the twilight, and the dominion of men begin. And indeed it was since befallen. 1 and the 7 and the 9 are destroyed, and the 3 have passed away, and with them the Third Age has ended, and the tales of the Eldar and Middle-earth draw to their close. Those were the fading years, and in them the last flowering of the elves east of the sea came to its winter. In time the Noldor walked still in the hitherlands, mightiest and fairest of the children of the world, and their tongues were still heard by mortal ears. Many of the things of beauty and wonder remained on earth, and in that time many things of evil and dread. Orcs there were, trolls and dragons and fell beasts, strange creatures old and wise in the woods, whose names are forgotten. Dwarves still laboured in the hills and wrought with each patient crafts, works of metal and stone that none can now rival. But the dominion of men preparing, and all things were changing, until the last the Dark Lord arose in Mirkwood again. Now of old the name of that forest was Greenwood the Great, and of its wide halls and aisles was a haunt of many beasts and of birds of bright song. And there was the king, Thranduil, in the age of the beech and the oak. But after many years, when nigh a third of that age the world had passed, a darkness crept slowly through the wood from the southward, and fear walked there in shadowy glades. Fell beasts came a-hunting, and crowl and cruel and evil creatures laid there for their snares. Then the name of the forest was changed, and Mirkwood it was called, for the nightshade lay deep there, and few dared to pass through, save only in the north, where Thranduil's people still held the evil at bay. Whence it came few could tell, and it was long ere even the wise could discover it. It was the shadow of Sauron, and the sign of his return. For coming out of the wastes of the east, he took his abode in the south of the forest, and slowly he grew and took shape there again. In the dark hill he made his dwelling, and wrought there his sorcery. And all folk feared the sorcerer of Dol Guldur, and yet they knew not at first how great was their peril. Even as the first shadows were felt in Mirkwood, there appeared in the earth, and west of Middle-earth, the Istari, whom men called the Wizards. None knew at one time whence they were, save Círdan of the Havens, and only to Elrond and to Galadriel did he reveal that they came over the sea. But afterwards it was said among the Elves that they were messengers sent by the Lords of the West to contest the power of Sauron, if he should rise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of goodwill to valiant deeds. In the likeness of men they appeared, old but vigorous, and they changed little with the years, and aged but slowly, through great cares laid upon them. Great wisdom they had, and many powers of mind and hand. Long they journeyed far and wide among elves and men, and held converse also with the beasts and the birds. And the peoples of Middle-earth gave to them many names, for their true names they did not reveal. Chief among them were the elves, called Mithrandir and Curanir, but the men of the north called Gandalf and Saruman. Of those Curandir was the eldest and came first, and after him Mithrandir and Radagast, and those are the other of the Istari that went into the east of Middle-earth, and do not come into these tales. Radagast was the friend of all the beasts and the birds, but Curanir was the most cunning of all the men. He was subtle in speech, and skilled in all the devices of smithcraft. Mithrandir was closest in council with Elrond and the Elves. He wandered far in the north, and in the west made never any land, any lasting abode, but Curanir journeys into the east, and when he returned he dwelt at Orthanc in the ring of Isengard, where the Numenorians made in the days of their power. Ever most vigilant was Mithrandir, and it was those he doubted most in the darkness of Mirkwood, for those many it deemed wrought by the ring-wraiths. He feared that it was indeed the first shadow of Sauron returning, and so he went into Dol Guldur, where the sorcerer fled from him, and there was a watchful peace for a while. But the length of the shadow returned, and its power increased, and in that time first was made the Council of the Wise, that is called the White Council, and therein Eldron and Galadriel and Círdan and other lords of the Eldar, and with them with Mithrandir and Curanir. And Curanir, that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief, for he had most studied the devices of Sauron the Old. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir had been the head of the council, but Saruman begrudged them that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have had no ties and no allegiance, save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place, nor be no subject and no summons. But Saruman now began to study the lore of the rings of power, their making, and their history. Now the shadow grew ever greater, and the hearts of Elrond and Mithrandir darkened. Therefore, in the time Mithrandir at great peril went to Dol Guldur, in the pit of the sorcerer, he discovered the truth of his fears, and escaped. And returning to Elrond, he said, True. Alas, says Argus, this is not one of the glory, as many have long supposed it is Sauron himself who has taken shape again, and now grows apace. He is gathering again all the rings to his land, and he seeks forever the news of the one, the heirs of Isildur, if they still live on earth. And Elrond answered, in the hour that Isildur took the ring, and would not surrender it, this doom was wrought, that Sauron should return. And yet the one was lost, said Mithrandir. While it still lies hid, we can master the enemy, if we gather our strength and tarry not too long. Then the White Council was summoned, and Mithrandir urged them to swift deeds, but Curanir spoke against them, and counselled them yet to wait and to watch. For I believe not, said he, that the one will ever be found again in Middle-earth. Into Anduin it fell, and long ago, I deem, it had rolled into the sea. There it shall be until the end, where all this world is broken, and the deeps are removed. Therefore naught was done at that time, though Elrond's heart misgave him, and he said to Mithrandir, nonetheless I forebode that the one will yet be found, and in one war will rise again, and the war of this age will be ended. Indeed, a second darkness it will end, instead, unless some strange chance deliver us, that my eyes cannot see. Many are the strange chances of the world, said Mithrandir, and how oft shall some come from the hands of the weak, wise, when the wise falter. Thus the wise were troubled, but none as yet perceived. Curanir had turned to dark thoughts, and was already a traitor in his heart, for he desired that he and no other should find the great ring, so that he might wield it himself, and order all the world to his will. Too long he had studied the ways of Sauron, and hoped to defeat him. Now he envied him as a rival rather than hated his works, and he deemed that the ring, which was Sauron's, would seek out for his master as he became manifest once more. But he were driven out again, then he would lie hid. Therefore he was willing to play with a peril, and let Sauron be for a time, hoping by his craft to forestall both his friends and the enemy, for when the ring should appear. He set a watch upon the Gladden field, but soon he discovered that the servants of Dol Guldur were searching all the ways of the river in that region. Then he perceived that Sauron had learned the manner of Isildur's end. He grew afraid and withdrew into Isengard, fortified it, and he ever probed deeper into the lore of the rings of power and the art of their forging. But he spoke of none of this to the rings, none of this to the council, hoping still that he might be the first to hear news in the ring. He gathered a great host of spies, and many of these were birds, for Radagast lent him his aid, divining naught of his treachery, and deeming that this was part of the watch upon the enemy. But ever the shadow in Mirkwood grew deeper, until Dol Guldur evil things repaired out of all the dark places of the world, and they were united again under one will, and their malice was directed at the Elves and the survivors of Numenor. Therefore at last the council was again summoned, and the lore of the rings was much debated. But Mithrandir spoke to the council, saying, it is not needed that the ring to be found, for while it abides on earth and is not unmade, still the power it holds will live, and Sauron will grow and have hope. The might of the elves and the elf friends is less than of old. Soon he will be too strong for you, even without the great ring, for he rules the 9, and of the 7 he recovered 3. We must strike. To this the Curandir now assented, desiring that Sauron should be thrust from Dol Guldur, which was nigh to the river, and should have leisure to search there no longer. Therefore, for the last time, he aided the council. They put forth their strength, and they assailed Dol Guldur, and drove Sauron from his hold, and Mirkwood from a brief while was made wholesome again. But their stroke was too late, for the Dark Lord had foreseen it, and he had long prepared all of his movements, and the Illari, the 9 servants, had come before him to make ready for his coming. Therefore his flight was but a feint, and he soon returned, and ere the wise could prevent him, as he returned to his kingdom in Mordor, and reared once again the dark towers of Barad-dûr. And in that year the White Council met for the last time, and Corridor withdrew to Isengard, and took counsel with none save himself. Orcs were mustering, and far to the east and the south and the wilds the peoples were arming. Then in the midst of the gathering, fear and rumour of war, where the foreboding of Elrond proved true, and the One Ring was indeed found again by a chance more strange than even Mithrandir had foreseen, and that had been hidden from Corridor and from Sauron, for it had been taken from Anduin long ere they sought it, being found by one of the small fisher folk that dwelt by the river. Ere the kings failed in Gondor, and by its finder was brought beyond search in dark hiding under the roots of the mountains, there it dwelt, and even in the year of the assault of Dol Guldur it was found again by a wayfarer, fleeing into the depths of the earth from the pursuit of the orcs, and passed into a far distant country, even the land of Peranath, a little people, the halflings, who dwelt in the west of Erenor, and ere that day they had been held by the small counts of the elves and by the men. Neither Sauron nor the wise, save Mithrandir, had in all his councils given thought to them. Now by fortune and their vigilance, Mithrandir first learned of the ring ere Sauron had news of it. Yet he was dismayed and in doubt, for too great was the evil power of this thing for any of the wise to wield, unless, like Corridor, he wished it to himself to become a tyrant and dark lord in his turn. But neither could it be concealed from Sauron forever, nor could it be unmade by the craft of the elves. Therefore, with the help of the Dundanes and the North, Mithrandir set a watch upon the land of the Paraneath, and bided his time. But Sauron had many ears, and soon he heard rumour of the One Ring, which above all things he desired, and he sent forth the Nazgul to take it. Then the war was kindled, and in battle with Sauron the Third Age ended even as it had begun. But those who saw the things that were done in that time, deeds of valour and of wonder, have elsewhere told the tale of the War of the Ring, and how it ended in both victory unlooked for and by sorrow long foreseen. Here it be said that in those days the heir of Isildur arose in the north, and he took the shards of the sword of Elendil, and in Imdalath they were reforged, and he went to war a great captain of men. He was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the 9 and the 30th heir in the right line from Isildur, and yet more like it to Elendil from any before him. Battle there was in Brohorn, and Gurrenir, the traitor, was thrown down, and Isengard broken. Before the city of Gondor a great field was fought, and the Lord of Morgul, captain of Sauron, there passed into darkness. The heir of Isildur led the host from the west of the black gates of Mordor. In the last battle they were Mithrandir, and the sons of Elrond, and the king of Rohan, and the lords of Gondor, and the heir of Isildur, with the Dundane of the north. There in the last they looked upon death and defeat, and there in all their valour was in vain, for Sauron was too strong. Yet in that hour was put to the proof which Mithrandir had spoken, and help came in the hands of the weak when the wise faltered. For as many songs have you sung, it was the Paraneath, the little people, dwellers in hillsides and meadows, that brought them deliverance. For Frodo the halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir, took upon himself the burden, and alone with his servant he passed through peril and darkness, and came at last the Saurons, despised even to Mount Doom, and there into the fire where it was wrought he cast the great ring of power, and so at last it was unmade, and its evil consumed. Then Sauron failed, and he was utterly vanquished, and passed away like a shadow of malice, and the towers of Barad-dûr crumbled in ruin. At the rumour of their fall, many lands trembled. Thus peace came again, and a new spring opened on earth, and the heir of Isildur was crowned King of Gondor and Numenor, and the might of the Dúnedain was lifted up, and their glory renewed. In the courts of Minas Anor the white tree flowered again, for a seedling was found by Mithrandir in the shadows of Mindolin that rose warm and white above the city of Gondor, and while it still grew, there were elder days that were not wholly forgotten in the hearts of the kings. Now all these things were achieved for the most part by the counsel and vigilance of Mithrandir, and in those few days he was revealed as a lord of great reverence, and clad in white he rode into battle. But not until the time came for him to depart was it known that he had long guarded the red ring of fire. At the first, the ring had been entrusted to Círdan, lord of the Havens, but he had surrendered it to Mithrandir, for he knew from whence it came, and whither at last he would return. Now take this ring, he said, for thy labours and thy cares will be heavy, but in all it will support thee, and defend thee from weariness. For this ring of fire, and herewith may be, thou shalt rekindle hearts of the Vavra of old, in the world where it grows chill. But for me, my heart is with the sea, and I will dwell by the grey shores, guarding the havens until the last ship sails. There I shall await thee. White was the ship, and long was it a building, and long it awaited at the end, where Círdan had spoken. But oh, when these things were done, and the heir of Isildur had taken up the lordship of men, and the dominion of the west had passed to him, then much was made plain that the power of the three rings was also ended, and those to the firstborn the world would grow old and grey. In that time the last of the Noldor set sail from the Havens, and left Middle-earth for ever. And the latest of all the keepers of the three rings rode to the sea, and Master Elrond took the ship that Círdan had made ready, and the twilight of autumn it sailed to Mithlond, until the seas of the bent world fell away beneath it, and the winds of the round sky troubled it no more. Borne upon the high airs above the high wastes of this world, and it passed into the ancient west, and an end was come to the Eldar story and of song.